The Anglo-Saxons were a people who inhabited Great Britain from the 5th century. They comprised people from Germanic tribes who migrated to the island from continental Europe, the descendants, and indigenous British groups who adopted some aspects of Anglo-Saxon culture and language. The Anglo-Saxon period denotes the period of British history between about 450 and 1066, after their initial settlement and up until the Norman conquest. The Anglo-Saxon period includes the creation of an English nation, with many of the aspects that survive today, including regional government of shires and hundreds. During this period, Christianity was re-established and there was a flowering of literature and language. Charters and law were also established. The term Anglo-Saxon is popularly used for the language that was spoken and written by the Anglo-Saxons in England and eastern Scotland between at least the mid-5th century and the mid-12th century. In scholarly use, it is more commonly called Old English. The history of the Anglo-Saxons is the history of a cultural identity. It developed from divergent groups in association with the people's adoption of Christianity, and was integral to the establishment of various kingdoms, threatened by extended Danish invasions and occupation of eastern England. This identity was re-established. It dominated until after the Norman conquest. The visible Anglo-Saxon culture can be seen in the material culture of buildings, dress styles, illuminated texts and grave goods. Behind the symbolic nature of these cultural emblems, there are strong elements of tribal and lordship ties. The elite declared themselves as kings who developed burghs, and identified the roles and peoples in biblical terms. Above all, as Helena Hamerow has observed, local and extended kin groups remain the essential unit of production throughout the Anglo-Saxon period. The effects persist in the 21st century as, according to a study published in March 2015, the genetic makeup of British populations today shows divisions of the tribal political units of the early Anglo-Saxon period. Use of the term Anglo-Saxon assumes that the words Angles, Saxons or Anglo-Saxon have the same meaning in all the sources. Assigning ethnic labels such as Anglo-Saxon is fraught with difficulties. This term began to be used only in the 8th century to distinguish the Germanic groups in Britain from those on the continent. Catherine Hills summarized the views of many modern scholars in her observation that attitudes towards Anglo-Saxons, and hence the interpretation of the culture and history, have been more contingent on contemporary political and religious theology as on any kind of evidence. Ethnonym. The Old English ethnonym, Anglo-Saxon, comes from the Latin Angli-Saxones and became the name of the people's beat calls, Anglo-Roman Gildas calls, Saxones. Anglo-Saxon is a term that was rarely used by Anglo-Saxons themselves. It is not an autonym. It is likely they identified as Angli-Sikhs or, more probably, a local tribal name such as Meas, Kanti, Galwis, West Sikhs, or Northern Himba. Also, the use of Anglo-Saxon disguises the extent to which people identified as Anglo-Scandinavian after the Viking Age of the conquest of 1016, or as Anglo-Norman after the Norman conquest. The earliest historical references using this term are from outside Britain, referring to piratical Germanic raiders, Saxones who attacked the shores of Britain and Gaul in the 3rd century AD. Procopius states that Britain was settled by 3 races, the Angeloi, Frisians, and Britons. The term Angli-Saxones seems to have first been used in continental writing of the 8th century. Paul the Deacon uses it to distinguish the English Saxons from the continental Saxons. The name therefore seemed to mean English Saxons. The Christian Church seems to have used the word Angli, for example in the story of Pope Gregory I, and is remarked non-Angli sed Angeli. The terms Aramlisk and Angelson were also used by West Saxon King Alfred to refer to the people. In doing so he was following established practice. The first use of the term Anglo-Saxon amongst the insular sources is in the titles for Athelstan, Angel-Saxonim Denorenke Gloriosissimus Rex and Rex Anglo-Saxoner and Northumbra Imperata Paganorum Gubernata Britannorenque Propugnata. At other times he uses the term Rex Anglorum, which presumably meant both Anglo-Saxons and Danes. The term Anglo-Saxon is used by Ethel, King Cnut in 1021 was the first to refer to the land and not the people with this term, Ila Englands Sinning. These titles express the sense that the Anglo-Saxons were a Christian people with a king anointed by God. The indigenous common Brittonic speakers referred to Anglo-Saxons as Saxones or possibly Saeson. The equivalent word in Scottish Gaelic is Sassenachan in the Irish language, Sasanic. Catherine Hills suggests that it is no accident that the English call themselves by the name sanctified by the Church, as that of a people chosen by God, whereas their enemies use the name originally applied to piratical raiders. Early Anglo-Saxon history. The early Anglo-Saxon period covers the history of medieval Britain that starts from the end of Roman rule. It is a period widely known in European history as the migration period, also the Volkerwanderung. This was a period of intensified human migration in Europe from about 400 to 800. The migrants were Germanic tribes such as the Goths, Vandals, Angles, Saxons, Lombards, Suebi, Frisi and Franks. They were later pushed westwards by the Huns, Avars, Slavs, Bulgars and Alans. By the year 400, southern Britain, that is Britain below Hadrian's Wall, was a peripheral part of the Western Roman Empire, occasionally lost to rebellion or invasion, but until then always eventually recovered. Around 410, Britain slipped beyond direct imperial control into a phase which has generally been termed sub-Roman migration. The traditional narrative of this period is one of decline and fall, invasion and migration. However, Heinrich Hark states, it is now widely accepted that the Anglo-Saxons were not just transplanted Germanic invaders and settlers from the continent, but the outcome of insular interactions and changes. Writing c. 540, Gildas mentions that, sometime in the 5th century, a council of leaders in Britain agreed that some land in the east of southern Britain would be given to the Saxons on the basis of a treaty, a foedus, by which the Saxons would defend the Britons against attacks from the Picts and Scotti in exchange for food supplies. The most contemporaneous textual evidence is the Chronica Gallica of 452, which records for the year 441, the British provinces, which to this time had suffered various defeats and misfortunes, are reduced to Saxon rule. Quote, this is an earlier date than that of 451 for the coming of the Saxons used by Bede in his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, written around 731. Gildas recounts how a war broke out between the Saxons and the local population. Hum calls it the War of the Saxon Federates, which ended shortly after the siege at Mons Badonicus. The Saxons go back to their eastern home. Gildas calls the peace a grievous divorce with the barbarians. The price of peace, Nick Hum argues, is a better treaty for the Saxons, giving them the ability to receive tribute from people across the lowlands of Britain. The archaeological evidence agrees with this earlier timescale, in particular, the work of Catherine Hills and Sam Lucy on the evidence of Spong Hill has moved the chronology for the settlement earlier than 450, with a significant number of items now in phases before Bede's date. This vision of the Anglo-Saxons exercising extensive political and military power at an early date remains contested. The most developed vision of a continuation in sub-Roman Britain, with control over its own political and military destiny for well over a century, is that of Kenneth Dark, who suggests that the sub-Roman elite survived in culture, politics and military power up to c. 570. However, Nick Hyam seems to agree with Bede, who identified three phases of settlement: an exploration phase, when mercenaries came to protect the resident population; a migration phase, which was substantial as implied by the statement that Anglia was deserted; and an establishment phase, in which Anglo-Saxons started to control areas, implied in Bede's statement about the origins of the tribes. Scholars have not reached consensus on the number of migrants who entered Britain in this period. Heinrich Hark suggests that the figure is around 100,000, based on the molecular evidence, but archaeologists such as Christine Hills and Richard Hodges suggest the number is nearer 20,000. By around 500 the Anglo-Saxon migrants were established in southern and eastern Britain. What happened to the indigenous Brittonic people is also subject to question. Heinrich Hark and Richard Coates point out that they are invisible archaeologically and linguistically, but based on a fairly high Anglo-Saxon figure and a low Brythonic one. Brythonic people are likely to have outnumbered Anglo-Saxons by at least 4-to-1. The interpretation of such figures is that while culturally, the later Anglo-Saxons and English did emerge as remarkably un-British. The genetic, biological makeup is nonetheless likely to have been substantially, indeed predominantly, British. The development of Anglo-Saxon culture is described by two processes. One is similar to culture changes observed in Russia, North Africa, and parts of the Islamic world, where a powerful minority culture becomes, over a rather short period, adopted by a settled majority. The second process is explained through incentives. Nick Hyam summarized in this way: as Bede later implied, language was a key indicator of ethnicity in early England. In circumstances where freedom at law, acceptance with the kindred, access to patronage, and the use and possession of weapons were all exclusive to those who could claim Germanic descent, then speaking Old English without Latin, a Brittonic inflection had considerable value. By the middle of the 6th century, some Brythonic people in the lowlands of Britain had moved across the sea to form Brittany, and some had moved west, but the majority were abandoning the past language and culture and adopting the new culture of the Anglo-Saxons. As they adopted this language and culture, the barriers began to dissolve between peoples who had earlier lived parallel lives. The archaeological evidence shows considerable continuity in the system of landscape and local governance, which was inherited from the indigenous community. There is evidence for a fusion of culture in this early period. Brythonic names appear in the lists of Anglo-Saxon elite. The Wessex royal line was traditionally founded by a man named Cerdic, an undoubtedly Celtic name ultimately derived from Caraticus. This may indicate that Cerdic was a native Briton, and that his dynasty became anglicized over time. A number of Cerdic's alleged descendants also possessed Celtic names, including the Bretwalda Ceawlin. The last man in this dynasty to have a Brythonic name was King Cadwalla, who died as late as 689. Development of an Anglo-Saxon society. In the last half of the 6th century, 4 structures contributed to the development of society. They were the position and freedoms of the CEORL, the smaller tribal areas coalescing into larger kingdoms, the elite developing from warriors to kings, and Irish monasticism developing under Finian and his pupil Columba. The Anglo-Saxon farms of this period are often falsely supposed to be peasant farms. However, a CEORL, who was the lowest-ranking freeman in early Anglo-Saxon society, was not a peasant but an arms-owning male with the support of a kindred, access to law and the war guild, situated at the apex of an extended household working at least one hide of land. The farmer had freedom and rights over lands, with provision of a rent duty to an overlord who provided only slight lordly input. Most of this land was common outfield arable land that provided individuals with the means to build a basis of kinship and group cultural ties. The tribal hideage lists 35 peoples, or tribes, with assessments in hides, which may have originally been defined as the area of land sufficient to maintain one family. The assessments in the hideage reflect the relative size of the provinces. Although varying in size, all 35 peoples of the tribal hideage were of the same status, in that they were areas which were ruled by their own elite family, and so were assessed independently for payment of tribute. By the end of the 6th century, larger kingdoms had become established on the south or east coasts. They include the provinces of the Jutes of Hampshire and White, the South Saxons, Kent, the East Saxons, East Angles, Lindsey and the Rear and Bernicia. Several of these kingdoms may have had as their initial focus a territory based on a former Roman civitas. By the end of the 6th century, the leaders of these communities were styling themselves kings, though it should not be assumed that all of them were Germanic in origin. The Bretwalda concept is taken as evidence of a number of early Anglo-Saxon elite families. What Bede seems to imply in his Bretwalda is the ability of leaders to extract tribute, overawe and/or protect the small regions, which may well have been relatively short-lived in any one instance. Ostensibly Anglo-Saxon dynasties variously replaced one another in this role in a discontinuous but influential and potent roll call of warrior elites. Importantly, whatever their origin or whenever they flourished, these dynasties established their claim to lordship through the link to extended kin ties. As Helen Peake jokingly points out, they all just happened to be related back to Woden. The process from warrior to sinning, Old English for king, is described in Beowulf. Conversion to Christianity in 565. Columba, a monk from Ireland who studied at the monastic school of Moville under Street Finian, reached Iona as a self-imposed exile. The influence of the monastery of Iona would grow into what Peter Brown has described as an unusually extensive spiritual empire, which stretched from western Scotland deep to the southwest into the heart of Ireland and to the southeast. It reached down throughout northern Britain, through the influence of its sister monastery Lindisfarne. In June 597 Columba died. At this time, Augustine landed on the Isle of Thanet and proceeded to King Ethelbert's main town of Canterbury. He had been the prior of a monastery in Rome when Pope Gregory the Great chose him in 595 to lead the Gregorian mission to Britain to Christianize the Kingdom of Kent from the native Anglo-Saxon paganism. Kent was probably chosen because Ethelbert had married a Christian princess, Bertha, daughter of Charibert I, the King of Paris, who was expected to exert some influence over her husband. Ethelbert was converted to Christianity, churches were established, and wider-scale conversion to Christianity began in the kingdom. Ethelbert's Law for Kent, the earliest written code in any Germanic language, instituted a complex system of fines. Kent was rich, with strong trade ties to the continent, and Ethelbert may have instituted royal control over trade. For the first time following the Anglo-Saxon invasion, coins began circulating in Kent during his reign. In 635 Aidan, an Irish monk from Iona chose the Isle of Lindisfarne to establish a monastery and close to King Oswald's main fortress of Bamborough. He had been at the monastery in Iona when Oswald asked to be sent a mission to Christianize the kingdom of Northumbria from the native Anglo-Saxon paganism. Oswald had probably chosen Iona because after his father had been killed he had fled into southwest Scotland and had encountered Christianity, and had returned determined to make Northumbria Christian. Aidan achieved great success in spreading the Christian faith, and since Aidan could not speak English and Oswald had learned Irish during his exile, Oswald acted as Aidan's interpreter when the latter was preaching. Later, Northumberland's patron saint, St. Cuthbert, was an abbot of the monastery, and then Bishop of Lindisfarne. An anonymous life of Cuthbert written at Lindisfarne is the oldest extant piece of English historical writing, and in his memory a gospel was placed in his coffin. The decorated leather book binding is the oldest intact European binding. In 664, the Synod of Whitby was convened and established Roman practice as the norm in Northumbria, and thus brought the Northumbrian Church into the mainstream of Roman culture. The episcopal seat of Northumbria was transferred from Lindisfarne to York. Wilfrid, chief advocate for the Roman position, later became Bishop of Northumbria, while Colman and the Ionan supporters, who did not change the practices, withdrew to Iona.